since you and Barry worked together on this, can you just explain a little bit more like your role in this book?
Okay. Well, it came about, I moved to Pennsylvania in 2000, Philadelphia in 2015. And I had just gotten my master's. I went back to school and got my master's in history. And when I got there, I was retired. I wanted to get involved in some kind of history project or whatever. And I discovered the history project in central Pennsylvania. So I emailed Barry and we got together to talk about what he was doing. They were taking oral histories of gay people. And he gave me like 50 of the oral histories that they had already done. And I read them and I was just blown away. And I was blown away because I realized I've been living in a bubble my entire life. I grew up in Arizona, but I left, like a lot of gay people, to go to a bigger city. So I moved to Houston, and there I lived in a gay neighborhood and there were gay bars and, it was all there for me. And then I moved to Boston, and that literally was a bubble. I mean, there were laws to protect you. I moved to a gay neighborhood. There were gay organizations, gay health centers, gay restaurants. And when I read these oral history, and then I moved to Philly and the same thing happened. When I read these oral histories, I realized there were people in the middle of the country that didn't have what I had, when I was coming out. And, they had no gay neighborhoods. They had no laws to protect them. It's like amazing how they even formed their social networks. And, it's such a different experience from a big urban environment. And, I said to Barry, it's like, there have been plenty of books written about these big urban areas, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and how the gay community evolved and stuff like that. But there's nothing been written about how a gay community, formed and developed in the middle of the country, in these small towns. And, the struggle to even form a network, let alone fight for their rights, was just amazing to me. I mean, I realized, God, I have been so blessed. I mean, I didn't go through anything like what these people did. And I said, I think this will make a great book. I said, but the problem would be finding a publisher. Well, as serendipity would have it, Barry had written some kind of an article about what he was doing. And one of the editors at Penn State Press had seen it. And she contacted Barry saying, we saw what you're doing. We think this could be material for a great book. Is there anybody that maybe you or somebody that in your organization could work with us to write and develop this book? Well, hello, me, I'll do it. And, it's just amazing, number one, to have a subject, and number two, to have a publisher fall into your lap. So, I worked for about 9 months on a book proposal and finally got a contract. And the big dilemma was like, I was thinking this, do you write the book about, chapters on discrimination, chapters on harassment, chapters on how they fought for their civil rights? And, the editor at Penn State said, just do it chronologically. And what happened? So with that, Barry and I sat down and said, okay, and Barry was the guidepost because he was from the area. Like what happened in the 60s, what happened in the 70s, who were the people involved? Who should we talk about? And then it just kind of came together once you did it by decades, and how, the middle of Pennsylvania came together and how they formed their gay networks, and how they fought for their civil rights. So that's kind of what happened and how the book came about. So Barry was kind of like here's the guidepost, and then I did the writing, and we both did research on things, and it just worked well together. It wouldn't have happened without Barry. You had to have somebody guide you. So
That's awesome that it all kind of fell together in like that timeline like that. Like,
yeah,
everything just sort of came together.
yeah.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you had been like sort of living in a bubble in these cities that you were living in. So can you just talk a little bit about like the contrast between your experience and like what you were reading about or hearing about when you were doing the research on like these organizations in Central PA, just like the difference, I guess, in living.
Well, first of all, when you're living like in a city like Boston, which I lived in for like 35 years, I experienced no discrimination and no harassment. That just didn't happen to me. I was the people at work that I worked with. Um, I worked for a big department store. I was a buyer and merchandise manager. They didn't care. I mean, first of all, retail is kind of open to gay people, but so that didn't occur. There was no one stopped me from getting promoted. Nothing like that. Um, I could walk out my door and I had gay neighbors, and there were, like I said, gay restaurants. I didn't have to fish around to find for a network. Um, Plus, in Massachusetts, it was illegal to discriminate against, gay and lesbian people. So it just didn't happen. And then in contrast, when I was going through these stories, it was just amazing. Like wrote about this woman, Nancy Helm, who decided in the 90s, this is in the 90s, she always wanted to open a gay bookstore. And she was living in Lancaster. And so she opened it on Main Street. And her bookstore was firebombed twice. And the last time it was so bad, she was forced to close it. And first of all, I interviewed her. And when she was retelling the story, tears just came to her eyes about what happened to her. And, I was thinking, I was in Boston at that time. We had 3 gay bookstores. Nothing happened. None of them were firebombed, and there were no protests outside. It was just amazing. And then on the work front, what about this woman, MJ Doherty? And she was highly placed in a financial institution, and her organization had annual meeting, which is in New York, in the Twin Towers. So she was there the day of 9/11, and she was on the phone in her hotel room, across from the Twin Towers. And she was on the phone with her partner, her lover, and she was late for her meeting. But because she was late, she was on her way when the airplane hit the tower, the first tower, and it was right where her company was meeting. And so everybody there was killed. And if it wasn't for the fact she was on the phone with her partner, she would have been dead too. Well, obviously, from the trauma, I mean, she talked about watching people jump out of the towers and walking over dead bodies, and her traumatic experience trying just to get to Staten Island. And then she finally made her way back to, Pennsylvania. But when all this was going on in 9/11, her partner called her office saying, "Have you heard from MJ?" Because she obviously knew what was going on and wanted to know what was happening. And her boss, who she was talking to, MJ's boss, said, "Well, who are you?" And she said, "Well, I'm MJ's partner. I'm her wife." And at work, the people where MJ worked didn't know she was gay. So he just kind of hung up and said, we'll get a hold of you or whatever. And when MJ finally returned to work, her boss had a whole different attitude toward her, was cold toward her. And when it came time for her review, she had made all her metrics, she surpassed her goals. She did everything right. And she was denied her promotion and denied her bonus and raise. So, she had to sue in order to get that. And when her lawyer was saying, we're not going to win on saying that you were, sexually discriminated against because you were gay. But we can based on your post-traumatic stress. And that's what they did. And she won. She got a promotion. She got her bonus, but she was moved to a different office. So, it's those kind of things with an employer that I never encountered, and so, let alone, the ability to find a gay neighborhood or a gay health center, those things just were always there for me. And in the book, we talk about how their gay networks formed. And, their fight for, a lot of them formed just through their fight for civil rights. And even though they were kind of political, they had a social aspect to them. And so, because each of these groups maybe had 9 or 10 members, it wasn't like hundreds, but all those things just kind of came together. And some of these political organizations contacted others. A lot of that happened with Governor Shaft. I don't know if Barry talked about him,
Yeah.
but, he formed this council, and a lot of these groups from all across central Pennsylvania got together, and they kind of found each other, and then they formed a network. So that was one big example of it. The other thing that shocked me was that I didn't know that the first anti-discrimination law that was ever passed in the entire United States was Governor Shaft, when he signed the executive order allowing gays and lesbians to work in state government. And that was the first in the nation. And nobody knows about it. It's kind of a footnote. And I thought that was a very big deal. It's like, this man is not getting the credit he deserves for what he did for the gay and lesbian movement. And also, along with that, we talked about the mayor of York, William Althouse, who at the time, back in the 80s, early 90s, to check my notes, when Colorado was trying to pass this ordinance that would not allow gays and lesbians to teach, or just total discrimination. And at that time, Mayor Althouse was the chairman of the Council of Mayors for the United States. And they were having their annual meeting in, I think, Denver. And so when he found out what was going on, they pulled out. They didn't have the meeting in Denver. And he was so upset by it that he went back to the little town of York and, presented a non-discrimination referendum for the town of York. And, it passed, obviously. It had opposition, but, you look back at our straight allies like Governor Shaft and Mayor Althouse that did these things that would advance, gay and lesbian rights in central Pennsylvania. So, all those were like things that needed to be talked about, that I felt weren't covered in all the gay histories that have been written. Like I said, they're mostly urban areas, but nothing was written about what happened in small town America in the hinterlands. there were books written about coming out, like in the South, but most of those were just coming out stories. It wasn't about how the gay network formed in Louisiana or Alabama. It was just mostly just coming out stories and the difficulty they shared. So this is what made this book different, because it was about how a community developed. There are individual stories in it, but it's really how this community developed.
That's what I think found really interesting about it, because like I've born and raised Pennsylvania. I've lived here my whole life, but like I didn't know anything that's in this book. So
Yeah,
that was really interesting, especially like you were saying about Governor Schott. Like I had no idea that Pennsylvania was the first
yeah,
one to pass like that sort of ordinance. Yeah, it's just been very enlightening, I think.
yeah.
Um, and can you talk a little bit of when you were like gathering research, listening to these oral histories, conducting interviews? Can you just talk about like what is the one experience, story, person, whatever that like has stuck with you the most, or like stuck out to you the most in doing that?
Um, it really has to be like I talked about Nancy Helm in the bookstore, um, because I interviewed her and I personally saw the pain that she went through, the tears in her eyes that even, you know, 30 years later, it still hurts. And even though in 30 years, much has changed in Lancaster, that wouldn't happen now, but the pain for her 30 years later is still deep and the wound is still there. And, I did a few interviews and that one just stuck with me. The other ones, I didn't interview, the interviews were done. And some of them I had to go back and ask them some questions, because there was, everybody's doesn't tell the whole story. And the people that were doing the interviews didn't have a book in mind. And so, I needed to fill in the gaps. And then sometimes, they didn't remember all the details of what happened. Like in the case of Nancy Helm, there was a newspaper coverage of it. So I was able to find the names of the offenders that did that, what happened in the court case, what sentencing they got after they found them. Nancy didn't remember all that, but there was a public record. And in a lot of these stories, there was a public record that, we had to go back and verify, because number one, Penn State Press was demanding, that everything, all the blanks be filled in and there's no assumptions made. It had to be, this is what happened and how you could back it up. So, in a lot of these cases, there was a public record to go back to.
That was actually something that I mentioned to Bill. I thought it was interesting and like good that like the book, it does, I think, well, in my opinion, it does a really good job of like just laying out the history, but like you can still like feel the emotion. Like it's not overly historical, not overly emotional, but like it is pretty much, it's fair facts, but at the same time, like there's no denying that there was, a lot of emotion involved in this movement.
Right. I mean, it was important to get these oral histories of it. Every story had people involved and there were emotions and caring, even when we talked about the AIDS crisis and the people that put together SCAN, Southern Central Pennsylvania, AIDS Alliance Network that would, at the early stages of AIDS, help people, find them lawyers, get them help, get them hospital help, when none of that was really available. And those are all deeply personal people that were there at the time of the crisis that fought and got these things done for the people during that terrible time. So it is all kind of emotional because there was so much pain and sometimes suffering, either through the AIDS crisis or just the fight for, civil rights, that, had an impact. And that's really needed to be told, along with just the bare facts of Harrisburg passed the anti-ordinance in '83, and then came Lancaster and then York, and it was, who were the people that did it? These are the giants whose shoulders we stand on, and that is what the story that had to be told.
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was interesting to see too, like, we talk about how like these urban areas, that's where these movements sort of start and are like, I guess, easier to start up. But then it like you almost see the same pattern like through the smaller cities in central
Yeah,
PA. Like it was Lancaster and then it was York and then it was down to Williamsport, down to like Carlisle, like that sort of thing. So I just thought that was really interesting.
yeah, because it starts to kind of have a snowball effect. Although Pennsylvania has yet to pass a statewide law, which is still kind of amazing. I think the last thing, it's like 35 or 40% of the state has no anti-discrimination laws. I mean, the big cities do: Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, the surrounding suburbs, Harrisburg, Lancaster, York, all that do. But there are little towns and stuff that don't.
Yeah.
So you can get married in Pennsylvania, but in a certain town, but you can get fired the next day for being gay. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I never realized that there wasn't a statewide protection. Like it almost just seems like automatic, I guess, in this day
Yeah.
and age.
Yeah, but it's not. And it's, we're still at risk for, losing these rights even in the big city, what's happening nationally. But that's a whole different discussion. So.
Yeah. Um, I think that was all the questions I had for you. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add, anything that you wanted to touch on. If so, feel free. But I think that was everything that I had.
So no, just I'm glad that people are still reading the book, because I think it's uh, my motivation was that this story needed to be told, because it's not just about Harrisburg, Lancaster, and York and all that, but it happens throughout the country in these small town areas. The only thing that was really advantage here was that there was someone like Barry collecting the oral histories and stories, in other places, in Kansas or Nebraska or whatever. No one's doing that. So those stories are kind of lost. And so, that's why I say bravo to Barry and his organization for collecting that, because even now in 2023, there's different things happening, to the transgender community, and, all that need to be counted and documented. So we touched on that a little bit. I interviewed a couple of people that were transgendered, and even for me, that was eye-opening, because I never really encountered it or researched it about what the trans people went through. It's a whole different experience. Like, I can relate to someone realizing that they're gay, but then, I never thought about what's it like if you realize that you're in the wrong body,
Yeah.
and what you have to go through. It's different than what a gay person goes through, in my opinion. It's a whole different mountain to climb.
It's like you don't know what you don't know until
Right,
you hear somebody say it or talk about it.
right, exactly. So, you just can't sit there and stay in your little gay and lesbian bubble, because there's a lot of other stuff happening that you don't really know about, that you can't empathize with until you talk to somebody and understand, what happens on, their point of view. It is in the book, because I also write book reviews for the Gay and Lesbian Review. And one of the books that I was given to review was called um, Once a Girl, Always a Boy. And it's written by the mother of this transgender guy, and what, the transgender person went through. And then I got a call from the mother thanking me, because I referred to her son as he throughout. I never, you know, went back and when talking about what happened now, saying, well, she went through this. Well, no, he went through this, and it was kind of like, um, and I didn't realize that I was doing that until she pointed it out, but it was like, well, he's he, that's who he is. And that's how he needs to be seen. So, although that's not in the book, but it's just another example of understanding the trans experience.
Yeah, definitely. It's important to read about and hear about things that you don't understand, that expand the worldview.
Yeah. So, so anyway, I felt, privileged to meet Barry and work with Barry and create this book. And I'm glad it's finding its way, in some colleges and universities in gender studies or American studies, because that's, kind of what I wanted to be one of those books that document LGBT history. So,
Yeah, it's a great job. An
thank you.
underserved community for sure.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down talking to me. And yeah,
It's been my
I'm really
pleasure.
excited